Forgive me, costume, for I have sinned. 1, I've given in to peer pressure. 2, I'm jumping on a bandwagon that I am highly uneducated to participate in. And 3, I'm not even planning on doing it properly. Over the last month, some incredible creators such as Sosteen, Rachel Maxey, Karolina Zabrowska and a whole bunch of other wonderful sewists and makers in the costume community have been reimagining or updating Disney characters to be more historical. I was quite content to just sit and watch these beautiful creations be created when the iconic Brazilian Baroness tagged me to join the fun. And how could I refuse that? After a small amount of deliberation, I settled on recreating the dress from Sleeping Beauty, where Aurora is disguised as Briar-Rose. I also liked how all the animals on the fabric tie into that classic Disney princess trope of being constantly surrounded by animals. As I mentioned before, I am woefully uneducated in the world of historical costuming, and what knowledge I have is tangled up in some sort of weird historical knowledge yarn, where some parts are really clear and distinct, and other parts are, well, not. Did not think about the fact that I now have to reel this back onto the ball. I originally thought of doing something 18th century because that's what I'm most confident in, and I was super psyched to do it. And then my anxiety kicked in and I realised that if I choose something in a very specific era like the 1780s, then if I do something that's not in the 1780s, then I'll be totally revealed as the complete and utter fraud that I am. Also, it's a lot of underwear. So with the Tudor tapestry in mind and my biggest brush in hand, I decided to go with something vaguely late Renaissance for my historical inspiration. So the whole costume is going to be made out of 3 parts, and that's the bodice, the petticoat or skirt, and the smock. I've made a version of this bodice before, so I won't need to do the mock-up, and I already have the smock ready. I just need to adjust a few things around the shoulders to make it a bit better. As for the skirt, it's really simple in construction, so I shouldn't have to make a mock-up for that either, but we shall see if those are immortal last words or not. I'm not going to go into details for the smock because there's a billion tutorials online, and I'll put the one that I use in the description below. The smock that I used for this one I made a few years ago, and it's just made out of an old cotton bedsheet. So the pattern I'll be using is Butterix B4669 UC, and I'm choosing this one because of the adjustable straps. So because I am a tall lady, it means that I won't have to do any adjustments to the bodice itself because I can just tie those looser. This pattern comes with really easy to follow instructions, so I'll just give you a brief overview of what I did. The first thing I realised about this fabric is that it's beautiful, but evil, and the back of it is really thready, so my feed dogs would just devour it if I put it in without flatlining at first, which is what I'm about to do. In the mindset of waste not want not, I ripped up the mock-up from my last video and used it for the lining fabric. Basting it in place by hand before stitching the 2 front and sides together so that I had 3 big pieces like this. I added boning channels that aren't in the pattern to cover the inside seam at this point, so I can give the bodice a little bit more structure. First I measured how wide they needed to be, and then I cut the channels out of the lining fabric. After I had finished the channels with the felling stitch, I realised that I urgently had to overlock the raw edges of everything because it was starting to fray really badly. Then to fill the channels, I cut cable ties to length, gently filing the edges to round them out so that they don't poke through or catch anywhere. Before I could stitch the 3 parts together, I had to bind the side front panels on 3 sides so that when it all came together it had a nice clean finish where one lot of binding tucked into the other. I bought a metre of black linen for the binding, and then I realised it was supposed to be bias binding, so I had to cut it in half and stitch it back together off kilter like this to get it big enough to follow the grain line. Don't look at me like that. P6 period. Then, after a rather convoluted series of events, I had a lovely long strip of linen bias binding ready to use. I machine stitched it to the front side first because that's the bit everyone sees and will be neater. I then folded it over the edge, pressing and tucking it under again once more as I went. I then stitched in the ditch from the front side to hold that all down, and then whip stitched the ends closed. Once that was done, I could attach all the panels together and proceed to the last lot of bindings, which covered the straps, but also encases the raw seam of the back and side front panels within it. So this pattern calls for metal eyelets, and the last time I made this with metal eyelets I got so frustrated and anxious because I was scared I was going to break the table hitting it too hard. So I did hand sewn eyelets instead, and I really enjoyed how meditative the process was. It also had the added benefit of giving me a few extra points in the historical adequacy department. To make the eyelets, I measured and pinned where I wanted them to go, then used an awl to separate the threads and went around the hole with 2 strands of embroidery thread, giving the hole a good stab every now and then just to keep the threads open. Eagle-eyed viewer has probably noticed that I haven't set these up for spiral lacing as would be correct for the time period. However, because Briar-Rose has little crisscrosses on her bodice, I'm going to be going with crisscrosses here too, for the aesthetic. This is one of my favourite spots to sew in, and it's just started raining, which means just hear it. This is so nice. So I've got just a handful more eyelets to do, and that's done, and then I can move on to the skirt. I decided to keep the skirt nice and simple by doing a gathered petticoat with ties. For the fabric, I bought some lovely natural coloured linen that was roughly 3 times the size of my waist. Before I did anything else, I needed to reserve a piece of fabric for the waistband. I started by thread pulling about 4 inches from one of the selvages so I could cut out my waistband as straight as possible. This was probably one of the most frustrating yet satisfying things that I have ever done. And then I cut this into 2 equal lengths and put them aside for later. For the petticoat itself, because I bought double wide fabric, I had to cut the rest of the fabric in half to make the front and the back panels, which felt really counterproductive as the very next thing I did was stitch them back together, but this time leaving a gap about the length of a water bottle at the top of both seams. I then trimmed one edge of the seam and hand felled them for strength. I had a huge epiphany when making this skirt because I tried hand finishing for the first time. Oh my god, it was so relaxing. It was nice just to get to sit in front of the telly instead of being hunched over my sewing machine like a goblin. I also folded back and stitched the raw edges of the slits I left earlier and took the opportunity to hem it now while it was flat before moving on to the gathering. Turning my machine to the long stitch length, I did 2 rows of stitches along the top of both pieces. I then pulled the top threads to gather it up into the same width as the waistbands. The beautiful thing about this style of skirt is that it really doesn't have to be perfectly measured to your waist, as they can overlap a little or a lot as is necessary to fit your body. The waistband was pinned edge to gathered edge from the outside and stitched down by machine. Before folding the waistband over the raw edge of the skirt, I needed to add the waist ties. Nice and quick, I cut 4 equal lengths of 1 cm wide twill tape, folded one edge and stitched it to the skirt with a lightning stitch for strength. I repeated this 3 more times and then continued on with the rest of the waistband. I folded the rest of the waistband twice more over the top of the gathered edge to enclose it. To secure it down on the inside, I decided to whip stitch it by hand, but others might choose to stitch in the ditch or just top stitch it, whatever works for you. So I absolutely love it. It came out way better than I expected it to, and way better than I imagined, and I 100% felt like a Disney princess, even if there was a distinct lack of woodland creatures coming up to me. And you know, I would definitely try and remake the Smock in future, maybe actually put the frills on, but try and fix this one to look like the one I designed. But it got to the point that I was just like, no, I'm just gonna put the neck back on it, straighten it up and leave it as it is, because it was all about the bodice and the skirt, and that was the bit that made it, in my opinion, Briar-Rose, which is the black and the natural sort of colour. Making this has taught me that I have some pretty big gaps in my historical clothing knowledge. Basically anything before the 18th century. Hand sewing can be actually really therapeutic as long as I don't have a deadline, and the finished result ends up just being so much better. Real talk. I thought people who were like, oh, hand sewing is better, were just being snobbish, but now that I've done it without a deadline and just could really just sit with it, I really enjoy how it's finished. It just feels so clean and neat, and I just felt really good doing it. And then finally, skirts with split sides are superior, and I'm going to be making more with the ties in future, just so I can have some more in my wardrobe, because it just feels fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me on today's sewing adventure. I have a couple more videos in the works that'll be coming out over the next month or so. If you'd like to know when they're uploaded, you can subscribe and click notification alerts, because I don't really have a schedule. In the meantime, you can find me on Instagram to see more of what I come up with, or just have a little chat. Until next time, goodbye, and I hope you have a magical day.
Your mobile device has lost connection.
Meditative.